Hey everyone, it's Blake here from ChessPathways.com, and in today's openings video, we're going to be talking about the Scotch Game. The Scotch Game is a symmetrical king's pawn opening, so both players are going to begin by putting their king's pawn in the center, e4, e5, and now after knight f3 attacking the pawn and knight c6 defending it, white's going to immediately try to open the center by playing pawn to d4. This is the starting position of the Scotch Game, which remains pretty popular at all levels of chess, and it's definitely a serious try for an opening advantage by white, because after these pawns get exchanged, white's going to be left with the sole pawn here in the center, and white has some pretty open lines of development for their pieces here. So let's see how the game can go. Black almost always plays here e takes d4 and exchanges those pawns. Black could consider playing something like d6, just defending this pawn, but white has several pleasant options here. White could play d5 and kick this knight away and get a space advantage anyways. White could play bishop b5 and go back into a Ruy Lopez now that they know that black's not going to play any of their most critical tries like the a6 main line or the Berlin defense. Instead, black is now playing a Steinitz defense with this move d6, which is okay for black, but these days it's not really considered the optimal defense to the Ruy Lopez, at least at the top level. So that's another option that white could have here. So going back here after d4 and black taking on d4, which is the main move, white actually has a couple options here. White can certainly just take their pawn back with knight takes d4, that's considered the mainline Scotch game, and it's what we're going to be looking at in this video. Bishop c4 is also possible. White does not have to take this pawn back right away, or even at all in some lines, and this is called the Scotch Gambit. That's going to be the subject of another video. But for now, let's go ahead and consider white taking that pawn back, knight takes d4, and we have the starting position of the mainline Scotch game here. Black has two main moves here, and those are bishop to c5 and knight to f6, both very logical developing moves. Let's go ahead and start by looking at bishop to c5, simply attacking this knight. White has a few options here. We can start by looking at bishop e3, certainly a very logical move. White just develops a piece and reinforces that knight. And now, black can play queen to f6 to add to the pressure here on d4. At first, it looks like a violation of opening principles to play queen f6, because usually this knight comes to f6, but this knight's going to be well placed on e7, and there's not really an easy way for white to harass this queen. This queen's actually doing a good job here, adding pressure to not only d4, but also even to f2 in some lines. For example, if white tries to get fancy here and plays knight b5, attacking the c7 square, black can throw in bishop takes e3, threatening checkmate here on f2, and white's not really going to have time to take this pawn here on c7. After knight takes c7, king d8, white simply has to deal with two threats at once, queen takes f2 and king takes c7, and white of course does not have time to take that rook in the corner, and this is not good at all for white. So coming back here after queen f6, usually white plays c3, just reinforcing this knight here, and I just pulled a sample line here. Black can play knight g to e7 to finish up their kingside development, bishop c4. Now black will often play knight e5 and attack that bishop, forcing it to retreat here to e2. White could consider just playing bishop e2 right away. It almost looks like they lose a tempo here by coming to c4 and then back to e2, but white's not really concerned about black getting this extra tempo knight e5. The knight could even be driven away from that square later and be a target for white expanding with f4, depending on the circumstances. Here black often plays queen to g6, threatening both g2 and e4. White should definitely get castled here and get their king out of the center, because they don't really have to be worried about black playing queen takes e4 just yet. Black simply doesn't have the development to justify going pawn grabbing like this. This bishop's locked in and the king's still not castled, and after, for example, knight d2 with tempo, queen g6, and f4, like we just mentioned, white's getting very serious compensation here for a pawn. f5 could be coming, and black actually might be in trouble here. So instead, going back after queen g6 and castles, black usually does not choose to take that pawn, and instead they just play d6 to open a line for this bishop, and both sides have some pretty active development here. So that's one possibility. Also going back here after bishop c5, we looked at bishop e3, knight takes c6 is another option, which looks like it forces black to accept a worse pawn structure here. Black's going to get doubled pawns if they take back this knight. But once again, the pressure on f2 comes into play, and black can actually play queen to f6. Black's temporarily down a piece because they did not recapture this knight, but white has no way to deal with all the threats here, and black's going to get their piece back. One of the main lines, for example, goes queen d2, simply defending the checkmate threat, and now black could take back with the queen here and preserve their pawn structure, But then after knight c3, this queen could be hit with bishop b5 later, and black might want to avoid that. So instead, d takes c6 is popular. This kind of accelerates black's development by opening this line for the bishop. And even though black has the worst pawn structure here, after knight c3 and, for example, bishop e6, black's position here is considered fine. White had to make a concession of their own by blocking in their dark-squared bishop with their queen here on d2. So we've looked at knight takes c6 here, and we've looked at bishop e3. White's third option here is to play knight b3 and just counterattack that bishop. And I'll just show one of White's ideas here. Black can play bishop b6 to maintain that bishop and keep it on this active diagonal. And now both sides are going to develop a knight here, knight c3, knight f6. And now White often plays queen e2 here, which looks counterintuitive at first, blocking in this bishop. But White's just hoping to get this move e5 in and disrupt Black's development. Black can play d6 to stop that, but now we see another point of the queen here on e2. It supports playing bishop to e3, where White can exchange off this powerful bishop here on b6 without fearing doubled pawns. And a lot of times here, White's going to castle queenside, and the position almost looks like something out of the Sicilian defense, with the knights here on b3 and c3, and White could play f3 and try to launch a pawn storm here on the black king if Black were to castle kingside. But Black has ways to deal with this. For example, after bishop e6, castle long, Black can play queen e7, Black's just finishing up the development of all their pieces, and they're still keeping White guessing about which way this king is going to castle. And for example here, if White plays f3, really indicating that they want to play g4 and launch a pawn storm, Black can simply castle queenside here. And both players are considered to have a fine position. So okay, we covered a lot of lines there after bishop c5. Now let's go back and look at Black's other main move, which is knight to f6. White could play knight c3 here. That looks very logical, just defending this pawn. And this actually transposes to a line from the Four Knights game. Just to show it, this is the same position after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, the Four Knights game, and now d4 and the exchange here on d4. So I covered this line on my video on the Four Knights. Black's main move here is bishop b4, pinning that knight. And I'll go ahead and put a link to that video down in the description if you want to look into this line. But the unique variation here, kind of unique to the Scotch game after knight f6, is if White decides to play e5 and harass that knight. They can't do it right away, of course, because this knight watches over that square, but one of White's options here is to exchange here on c6, knight takes c6, and now after b takes c6, White can play e5. This is one of those cases where Black does not want to take with the d-pawn to open up a line for the bishop. Simply, White could exchange queens here, and this does not look so great for Black. The pawn structure almost looks like a Berlin endgame from the Ruy Lopez, but Black doesn't even have the advantage of the bishop pair. White still has their two bishops, so this is not what Black's looking for, and instead they're going to take with their b-pawn. So b takes c6, e5, and now this knight really doesn't have a good square to go to. Going to g8's not good, coming to h5 or g4 is not safe, of course. If the knight goes to e4, it's probably going to be harassed there. White's going to gain a couple tempos by attacking it, and the knight's probably going to have to swing back around to e6, which is still kind of an awkward square. So that's not great. If the knight came to d5, this looks reasonable at first, but now White's going to play c4 and attack that knight, and the knight's probably going to get relegated to the b6 square, where it's obviously kind of locked away from the action, or possibly to e7 after c4, knight e7. But it's pretty easy to see that no one really wants to play this position as Black. So instead, after e5, Black should play queen e7 and pin that pawn. And this does block in the f8 bishop, but the good news is White has to do the same thing and block in their bishop because queen e2 is pretty much forced. There's no other move that defends this pawn and breaks the pin. So now this knight is once again under attack, but Black can now play knight to d5, and the idea is if White plays c4, now Black can play bishop a6 and pin this pawn to the queen. That's the second time Black has made use of a pin to defend this knight, and this is called the Mieses variation of the Scotch. This line leads to some pretty interesting imbalanced positions. I'll just go ahead and show the main line here. If White plays b3 here, not only adding support here to this pawn, but also opening up a path for this bishop to defend the vulnerable e5 pawn, Black could play g6, trying to add some pressure to this e5 pawn, and also finish up their kingside development. g3, this bishop needs a square, of course. This queen here on e2 takes away its other path. Bishop g7, bishop b2, castle, bishop g2, rook a8. All very logical moves. This e5 pawn has kind of become the focal point here, and this knight's been under attack the whole time, but of course there's always this pin here on the queen. white can go ahead and get castled, and it looks like black is winning a pawn here on e5, but if black takes that pawn, the queen's going to get exchanged in the process, and that means that this pin will no longer exist, and white can take this knight here on d5. But this rook here is still on f1, black's still going to at least get the exchange, so the main line goes bishop takes e5, queen takes e5, queen takes e5, bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, all those exchanges happen, and now white gets to take on d5, and black gets to take on f1, king takes f1, c takes d5, knight c3, and black plays c6, trying to restrict the minor pieces here. And we're left with an endgame where black has 2 pawns and a rook for the 2 minor pieces. Black does have a doubled pawn, and really both sides can play for a win from here. The game still is very imbalanced. Okay, so we've covered pretty much all the main lines here after black plays e takes d4 and bishop c5, or e takes d4 and knight f6. Black really doesn't have any other good moves here. For example, d6 is kind of passive, there's no real reason to block in your bishop. Bishop b4 has been tried, but white can simply play c3. And I guess black could argue that it's, good to provoke c3 before coming back to c5, but that's probably not true. We saw how in one of the main lines here with queen f6, white wants to play this move c3 anyway, so there's no real value for black to provoke that move. I think they're actually just helping white out if they play this bishop b4 check line. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please make sure you visit chesspathways.com and get signed up. I'll go ahead and put a link for you down in the description. It's totally free, only takes a few seconds to join, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking, along with lots of other free content when you do. I'm trying to help more players become chess masters, hopefully in a fraction of the time it took me. Thanks, and I'll see you there.